guys! In this video tutorial, I am going to show you how I create a character illustration based on reference. I didn't want to use a single reference picture here, so instead I've gathered this small collection of photos that I found on Pinterest. Feel free to pause the video and take a better look at them, but in general, I really liked the overall vibe, the style of the clothing, and the poses of the two girls. I decided to use the one on the left because the pose is a little bit simpler and I don't want to overwhelm you with anything too complicated. So the first step is the rough gesture sketch, where obviously I'm focusing on the gesture and the pose of my character and also the proportions, but I'm thinking about the big shapes and I'm not focusing on the face or anything that is too small. I'm also using the drawing grid option in Procreate to make sure that my character is stepping on the ground and not just floating in space. I keep this sketch super loose and I don't focus on the face at all. I just want to lay down the tilt of the head and have an idea of the angle, but that's it. I don't need to even add the hair or anything like that. In the second step, I lower the opacity of my rough sketch and I create a new layer on top where I'm going to slightly clean it up a bit, but still I'm going to keep it quite loose and sketchy. As you can see, I'm pushing the design a little bit here, but again, I'm keeping it very loose. I'm making the legs a bit thinner because I want to draw a character that is very thin and narrow and tall. I'm also drawing everything, the naked body. I'm not drawing any clothes yet because I want to make sure that the structure and the anatomy of my character will be correct. And as you can see, I often draw through the volumes. Like for example, you can see how I drew the chest underneath the shoulder because I want to make sure that the volume is correct, and this really helps make my designs look more three-dimensional and less flat. In the next step, I'm going to clean up the sketch one more time. I lower the opacity of both of my layers that I have so far, the one with the body and the one with the head. As you can see, I'm cleaning it up, but still it's a little bit loose. I don't want to draw any perfect lines yet. I just want to make more design decisions at this stage and also add the clothing before it's time to ink. I'm drawing the jacket here, but I'm drawing it on a new layer on top of the body because I just think it makes things easier and you can easily erase parts that you don't like and try again. When I'm drawing the clothing on my characters, I try to use every opportunity that I have to show the volume. So for example, the skirt is not going to be this completely flat line. Instead, I'm trying to imagine how the skirt is going around the legs, and so I'm drawing this curved wrapped line. I'm also adding the shoes here, and I'm keeping them quite simple. I sometimes like to add a lot of details to the shoes and draw every single shoelace and just everything that I see on the reference picture. Here on the reference, she's wearing different shoes. I'm adding sneakers. And I also decide to include only 3 shoelaces to keep it simple because the shoes are very far from her face, obviously. And I don't want to make them too detailed because they're going to draw too much attention to themselves. Here it's time to work on the face a little bit more. But I kind of had difficulties with the face and I redrew it many times. I had to erase the footage because it was too long, but you will probably see me erasing and trying it again many times in the next couple of minutes. I think the general problem was that the features on the face were in a slightly different perspective than the head of the character, so it looked a little bit off. I think this is also probably the place where I should mention that I used the undo quite a lot. So the real-time footage of this drawing was 7 hours and I had to cram it into about 30 minutes. And I didn't want to speed up the video because it would have been way too fast and you could miss some of the things that I do and some details. I wanted to keep it real time somehow, so I had to trim out a lot of the footage in order to keep it real time. So I hope this won't be too confusing for you. And also, if you see me draw a perfect line and move on to the rest of the drawing, keep in mind that this is probably the 20th time that I'm making this line and I just trimmed out the rest of the footage so you don't see it. And the reason why I'm saying is because I don't want to bring you down and make you feel as if you're super slow and I'm very fast and everything that I draw is perfect and, you know, in the correct place. More often than not, that's not the truth. And I struggle a lot with some things, like for example, the face here. I redrew it many times, so that happens very often. And if it happens to you, just know that it's okay. I like using the liquify tool to push things around and see if I can improve the structure and the design in general. And here I'm completely erasing the face and trying again. I kept a backup of the face, so I duplicated the layer and hid, the original. And on the new one, I erased the face and drew it, again. Because I don't know if I will manage to do it better. I mean, I might as well not, so I like to have the option to go back to the original face. And if you notice this middle line crossing the face, I sometimes, when I struggle with the structure, I like to draw this line and imagine literally as if someone drew with a pencil on her face. I try to imagine what the shape of that line would be, because it really helps me see the volume and place the features in the correct places. I also try to give my character an expression. Even though it's a very subtle one, I think it really adds to the general feeling. I think people like to relate to characters that are more human-like, not only visually, but also characters that have an emotion on their faces or ones that have personality. And so the expressions really help with that. Of course, I don't always do it in every single drawing. Sometimes I like a good comfort zone sketch where I just relax and draw this neutral blank face. But in general, I try to keep a balance between the two, and I try to sometimes push myself and draw expressions on my characters because it's just more appealing and it has more life. If you notice here, I'm drawing the jacket one more time on top on a new layer because I want to push it a little bit and exaggerate its proportions. I want it to look more cartoony, and essentially this is what making things cartoony is, pushing the proportions. So I like the contrast between the big sleeve and her tiny thin body. So I want to push that a bit further, and I make the sleeve even bigger. And also, if you notice in the reference picture, the jacket is on top of one of her shoulders and it's covering half of her torso. I didn't really like that because it makes the drawing a bit unclear. And so I decided to push the jacket off her shoulder on both sides. And now it's time for inking. I'm using my favorite custom inking brush here, but you can use any other textured inking brush or your favorite one, whatever it is. Once again, I would like to remind you that I use a lot of undo in this process, so what you see is not what actually happened. I hit the undo many times and I repeat lines over and over again until I get them right. I try to have some variety in my line, so if you notice, on some places it will be thinner and on other places it will be thicker. Usually where I have two objects overlapping, I like to have the one in front to have a thicker line because that really shows that it's in front and it adds a volume and perspective in a way. I'm also keeping the folds on the jacket simple. I don't need to add every single fold that I see on the reference picture. And I'm also not really looking at the reference very much. If you notice, I turned it off. Even though this is the cleanup stage and the inking stage, I still like to keep my line a little bit sketchier and looser. I sometimes repeat a line 2 or 3 times and keep all the attempts because I just like this loose feeling. I don't like to have perfectly straight or curved lines. And once again, I'm using every opportunity to show volume, and wherever I have a clothing piece that is wrapping around the body and that is tight, I use this opportunity to show the volume that the clothing is wrapping around. Like for example here with the top wrapping around her waist and also the skirt. I don't really like how the skirt and the top are both super tight around her body. I think it looks a little bit not so interesting, and the silhouette is quite simple. So I decide to spice it up a little and give her this crop top. I used to draw a lot of characters with super tight clothes when I was more of a beginner because I didn't really know how to add the clothing on top, and I was so proud of the anatomy that I didn't want to hide it. But I think it's important to learn when to let go because this works better for the drawing. So I might as well sacrifice a little bit of the anatomy that I drew underneath, you know, and just do what works better for the drawing. Because after all, the goal is not to show off what I can do, it's to produce a good looking image, so it's important to keep that in mind. I'm also using the choker on her neck to show the volume of her neck, just as I do with the clothes. And if I want to add details to the drawing, I usually add them in the area closer to the face, because in this case, this is where we want the viewer to look at. I don't want them to focus on her shoes or her legs. I want the focus to be around her face, so I try to distribute the details closer to that area. And as I mentioned earlier, I like to draw through the volumes and the shapes Like for example, you see with the sleeve around her hand here, I drew it, the entire oval shape, and then I will erase the parts that are covered by the hand. And I think that really helps make my designs more three-dimensional. I feel like I'm talking a lot about making the designs more three-dimensional, but with these flat colors that I'm using, I think it's very easy to end up with a super flat looking design. And this is not really my goal. I want to have a balance between volume and flatness. So I try to show volume with my design instead of my color. And then I can afford to draw these flat colors and not be worried about the design looking overly flat, if that makes sense. Here I'm adding some piercings to her ears because it wouldn't be my character if she didn't have 20 earrings. When I'm drawing the hair, I like to use these lines inside of the shape of the hair to show its volume once again. And something that I always keep in mind is to not space these lines evenly. So I try not to keep them at the same distance from one another because this tends to look a little bit boring and also confusing. Instead, I try to put two lines closer to one another and then have one that is further apart from them. I think this is much more visually appealing. When I'm making the face, I always keep in mind that the line should be thicker at areas where there is more bone showing, and it should be thinner at areas where there is more flesh. Like for example, around the cheekbone, the line is thicker, and then around the cheek, it is thinner because you have this fleshy part there. And I also keep in mind that because she has this expression, one of her eyebrows is pulling up and the other one is pushing down. And I keep in mind that there is flesh between the eye and the eyebrow. So on one side, this flesh will be quite stretched because the eyebrow is going up. And then on the other side, the eyebrow will be going down. So there will be flesh between the eye and the eyebrow. It will be squashed. And so the eye will be a little bit more closed. But one thing that will never change is the corners of her eyes, the inner corners. So I always try to make sure that both of the corners of both of her eyes are on the same level. And this way I can be sure that one of her eyes is not higher than the other one. When drawing the eyebrows, I also try to follow the shape and the volume of the skull underneath. Here I'm adding a few more of those lines to show the texture of the hair, and once again I'm trying to space them out unevenly so that it looks more interesting. And the same goes for these little lines on her beanie. And I also don't add each individual one because then it will look too busy. When I'm drawing the shoes here, I try to keep them a little bit simpler, as I already said. I don't want to add too much detail because it just will be too distracting. And now it's time for my favorite part, which is the colors. This is a very messy process for me. I try to make it as clear as possible here, but I also had to speed up some parts because it's just too long. In general, I knew I wanted to start with a almost white background, slightly warm, and I knew what the skin tone will be, and I also had this idea of orange and green for this piece. I wanted to have this leopard skirt and the oliveish green jacket. So I tried to lay down those two colors first and then try to work up the rest of the color scheme around them. I usually like to do that when I have an idea for just one or two colors in my image. I like to add those first and try to design the rest of the colors around them. And because I'm using flat colors, I need to make sure that I have a lot of contrast going on because I don't have any shadows to help me with that. So I try to avoid using too light and pastel colors because everything will look very flat then. And here is a sped up process of another color scheme that I wanted to try out, and which is actually the one that I end up using. Something about the green jacket was not working, so I decided to try orange and this bluish cyan color instead. I really liked the idea of her having very light blonde hair, but unfortunately that wasn't working very well because the background is almost white and they were just blending too much. So I decided to give her this grayish, darker mid-tone hair. I think it creates a nice contrast and frames the face really well so that it's separated from the background. And now it's time for the cleanup. Now in this step, I take this color sketch layer, I make it smaller and I put it on the side, and basically I'm going to color pick all of the colors there and use it on my design. And I have this weird new technique of coloring my designs. I don't think it's the best one honestly, but I'm quickly going to tell you what it is. Basically, I take the selection tool and I outline everywhere where there is skin. In this case, her tummy, her hand, and her face and neck. And I'm going to select all of these at the same time and then fill them in with the same skin color. And then whatever I'm drawing inside of those shapes, I will either alpha log the layer and draw inside, or I will create a new layer and clip it to that one and draw, because I want to preserve this texture that I have from the brush. And if I don't use alpha log, it's going to be gone the second I start drawing on top. I hope that makes sense. I'm not going to show you how I outline every single object because it's literally going to take a lot of time. So instead, I'm just going to show you how I color the different objects. And as I said, I don't think this is the best technique out there, so that's why I'm not going to go into too much detail about how I do it, because I plan on changing things a little bit soon, so yeah, it just don't make much sense. Here I'm creating a new layer and clipping it to the layer of the face. And with this warmer and more saturated color, I'm painting the cheeks and the nose as well. I'm using the Bonobo Chalk brush, which is a default Procreate brush. And I'm also using the 6B pencil to erase the parts around the nose that I don't need. And I'm also going to use it to draw a small shadow underneath the nose because I want to show that it has a bottom plane as well and it's not completely flat. And I also alpha locked the layer of the nose so that I can only paint inside of it. I'm painting the rest of the facial features on a new separate layer, which is once again clipped to the layer of the skin tone. I like having consistency in my colors, so for example the eyes, the earrings and the shirt are pretty much the same color. I selected the skirt shape and on a new layer I filled it in with this dark orangey brown color. And I'm adding the texture on a new layer, again clipped to the skirt. And once again for consistency, I'm adding this same magenta pinkish stripe on the skirt that I have on the beanie. I want to add a little bit more volume around the face, so I'm selecting this shape of the hair and filling it in with this slightly darker and less saturated color. I think that adds a little bit more volume because naturally this part of the hair will be darker. And I also decide to add this highlight to the hair as well. And I keep its shape very simple. I don't want anything too complicated. And I also painted the tip of this little strand of hair with a lighter color because I want to separate it from the hair behind it. I usually don't add any shadows to my designs, but I thought it might look good here. So I created a new layer and clipped it to the jacket, and with this slightly darker color, I go around the jacket and add some very big shadows. I don't want to make the shapes of the shadows too complicated because it will just look too busy and it won't be very appealing. So just as with my design shapes, I try to keep the shapes of my shadows very simple too. And I also add a simple shadow to her face as well, which is on a new layer set to multiply, and I'm using this almost white color, slightly warm. Now I'm back to my line art layer, but I actually created a new one on top, I think. And I decided to add some more wispy hairs because I like having this small detail around her face. And I'm also darkening some of the lines on her hair shape because they were too light and it didn't create enough contrast. After I was done with the drawing, I went back and added a warm gradient on an overlay layer coming from the bottom. And I think I also added a few more shadows, but nothing too major. Unfortunately, I didn't record that, but I don't think it changes anything that much, so... So I think that's it for this video. It's obviously a little bit challenging to explain my entire thought process in 30 minutes when the actual drawing time was a lot longer than that. But I did try to give you the most important information. I didn't talk too much about Procreate and its tools because honestly I want to make a separate video for that and be able to explain in depth all the settings that I have and all the shortcuts that I have set. But I hope it was helpful to see overall how I use the program, how I navigate, what brushes I use and so on. I hope this video was helpful and that you learned something new and maybe got inspired. Thank you so much for spending time with me today, and I will talk to you next time.